Hey guys, welcome back to the One Room Schoolhouse. We are here at WallBuilders, continuing this week looking at different biographies. We've talked about a lot of different heroes. Encourage you to check out some of their stories. A lot of these we do sell on, actually all of these we do sell on WallBuilders.com. And there's a whole lot more that are there as well if you want to find out more. The two that we are finishing up this week with are going to be George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Now, both of these are names that should be very well known. In fact, so well known that most people should know their stories. The problem is most people don't know their stories, right? One of the things that whenever we do tour groups, we'll ask, okay, so what's the most famous story, or what story do you know the best about George Washington?
Oh, I know.
The answer always is
Cherry tree.
Which
every time.
It's not even a real story. I mean, it's a real story, right? It's not a true story, to be more accurate, because the very early biographer of Washington, right after he died, he wanted to get the story of Washington out there, and he wanted to kind of highlight how honest and the integrity of George Washington. Yeah. So to highlight the honesty of Washington,
he makes up a story.
He fabricated, right? Just lie. I mean, it's still...
It's highly likely that
it kept the tone, right? It kept the tone. But yeah, Washington, there's no record he chopped down this cherry tree. But if that's the only part of the story we know, this is why there's a problem when people say, well, we know the name Washington, but we don't know who he was or what he did. And his story really is kind of remarkable. As a boy, kind of what he discovered in education and family and out in the country, and becomes a surveyor, and then he's a scout in the military, and when he's 23 under General Braddock, and what we know is we call it the Bulletproof George Washington story.
Which is another great book you can find at WallBuilders.com.
But that story is, to me, one of the coolest stories of Washington.
Yeah.
And certainly when we talk about God's providence throughout American history, and how God used people, protected people, worked in people's lives, this is a story where for sure you can highlight,
for sure,
God saved Washington because after that battle where the British were defeated, and he was a soldier with the British during this time, he goes back and he takes off his jacket. There's bullet holes through his jacket. Now, he was the last surviving officer on horseback. All the other British officers have been shot down.
And Washington himself had several horses shot out from underneath him. I mean, he was targeted. He was the only officer not wounded at all.
There were over 80 officers in that battle. And really, it was a lopsided battle because out of 1,300 soldiers, 714 were shot down. Out of 80 officers, he's the only officer not shot down off horseback, and it wasn't because they didn't try, because as you mentioned, bullet holes through his jacket, at least 4 bullet holes, several horses shot from under him, combing bullet fragments from his hair. They were trying.
Well, and this is where he recognized the providence of God, because there's letters he writes to his family, to his mom, to his brother, saying, look what God did protecting, keeping me safe. Actually, in our collection, we do have several writings. We actually have a whole collection of writings from Washington. It's the one below it. So in this one, we have a letter from George Washington. This is an actual letter from George Washington. And this is when this is later in life. He's at Mount Vernon, and he's writing, asking for help finding a worker for Mount Vernon for what they're doing. But this is a George Washington letter, which is really cool. One of the things about Washington, like many founding fathers today, he is considered to be a guy who not really strong on faith, not so much someone who believed in Christianity, didn't believe in Jesus.
He's certainly one of the guys that a lot of academics will say he's a deist, right? And they'll list a whole lot of different reasons for that. One of them is the fact that in his writing, he constantly refers to providence, but not Jesus.
Right, which, so right over here is one of the most famous paintings, or this is a lithograph, right? But this is a very famous depiction of George Washington kneeling down to pray. And people today question that. In fact, different park authorities and park services, this is supposed to be from Valley Forge, which down here at the bottom says the prayer at Valley Forge. And today people question, now wait a second, did he really pray? We're not sure he actually prayed there at Valley Forge. Well, the reason we can with confidence say whether this exact account of that painting happened, I'm not real sure, but there were people at Valley Forge who talked about going and looking for Washington, and he was praying. Some famous names talked about it.
Yeah, you have generals like Henry Knox, Marquis de Lafayette. Had all these generals say, we were looking for Washington, and he talked to him about something, found him out in the woods praying. Then you also have generals like John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, who is a preacher who actually Washington asked him to recruit guys, so he just took his church and took them to the field, and a bunch of guys came with him out of Virginia. And his father, the father of Muhlenberg, is the founder of the Lutheran Church. And so
In America.
In America, that's right, in America.
He was Luther?
Yeah, and he was Lutheran. The father comes to visit son, John Peter, there, who's the general, and he says, I've watched Washington. This is a guy who's really religious. He does know Jesus. He believes in the atonement of Jesus. I mean, here's the head of a denomination.
And how would you know he believes in the atonement of Jesus unless you saw something, unless you had a conversation?
Yeah, that's right.
And this is where the people that knew Washington had a different description of him, of his character, of his nature. And the problem today is that
And by the way, let me add, one of the things we didn't pull out here, but we've got right next door, is a poem done by a Baptist pastor who worked with Washington. And it's a 56 stanza poem that he wrote in his own hand. It's called Washington and Christ. From a pastor who knew Washington, who worked with him. That's a pretty significant statement.
And this is where the people that knew him, right, different from modern academics who say, well, he was a deist, he didn't really believe in Jesus, he wasn't really a Christian, and there's kind of some anecdotal evidence they will point to, or like referencing some of his writings where he says providence and doesn't mention Jesus. Hang on, come back over here. We've got a few more things to show you. So, there have been some early biographies that were done. This one is George Washington, the Christian, and this kind of highlights some of his Christian faith. And there's many biographies that have been done of George Washington, and so many of the early ones did highlight the fact he was a Christian.
Yeah.
Today, people question it, but even right beyond the defense of him as a Christian, right? What he did as a military leader after the Revolution at the Constitutional Convention, it's argued that without his leadership, that convention would have fallen apart.
Yeah.
There never would have been a constitution, which means that maybe there's not a United States of America that comes together. After that, he's chosen president. And generally, when somebody's chosen a leader, there's like elections, there's people on different sides. For Washington, it was a little different.
The only president of the United States chosen unanimously with no opposition. Nobody ran against him. Nobody's going to run against him. If Washington wants it, he's our guy. He was that popular, that unifying, and that strong. And actually, at his inauguration, once he gets inaugurated president, he sets the standard for all of the presidents. He has 8 religious activities in his inauguration. Now, every president...
Or surrounding it.
Or surrounding
right,
it.
because they
That's
did
right.
church, they did communion, they had prayer service, there's so much.
And they did that as the full Congress. I mean, the president and Congress went to these religious meetings.
We also
amazing.
have, this is the very first printing of the very first presidential prayer proclamation. The reason it was the very first is because Washington was the first president. So right over here, it's a newspaper printing of that prayer proclamation after Congress had done the Bill of Rights, which was part of what they were tasked to do. Congress then petitions Washington and says, hey, we've completed drafting this. We've now sent it to the states for ratification. We should have a time to thank God for we accomplished this and we should celebrate this. So he did a prayer and thanksgiving proclamation saying we should thank God for this whole thing. There's so many cool parts to his story today people don't know, which is why little biographies are great to learn more of his story, learn more about the character and nature of Washington, and we could spend literally hours just talking about Washington, his stories, Providence,
We've got
the
a lot of
military.
really good articles online too if you want to find out more about like the Henry Muhlenberg walking through the camp and seeing these things about George Washington. So also check out our articles online to find out more about specifically Washington and his faith. But another one of the guys, very similar, another president, Abraham Lincoln, actually looked back at Washington's story in life in a lot of the ways that he would lead. In fact, we've actually got a couple of general orders that Lincoln mentioned and specifically calls back to Washington because while Washington was head of the Army Commander-in-Chief during the Revolutionary War, he actually issued several statements saying, you know, if you're in the military, you cannot swear, you know, you need to go to church on Sunday even while we're in camp.
And this particular order was his first order that he gave to the troops. It's right after he's appointed commander-in-chief. He organizes the military, says, here's how you're going to divide up your regiments. Every regiment's going to have a chaplain. And here's what I expect of you in the regiment. And you can just read the quote there. This is what Lincoln is reissuing in the middle of the Civil War as the order to the Union troops, same order Washington gave to Revolutionary troops.
He says the discipline and character of the national forces should not suffer, nor the cause they defend be imperiled by the profanation of the day or name of the Most High. At this time of public distress, adopting the words of Washington in 1776, men may find enough to do in the service of God and their country without abandoning themselves to vice and immorality. So In Lincoln's orders, he is quoting Washington's orders, further testifying to the fact of, just the impact Washington had, but also to the Christian character of Abraham Lincoln, who's a guy who comes under fire a lot from academics.
And so let me read this part of the order too. He says, the general hopes and prays that every officer and man will execute and as becomes a Christian soldier defending the dearest rights and liberties of the country. That's what Washington gave to the revolutionary troops. This is what Lincoln is giving to the Union troops. Act like a Christian soldier defending the dearest rights and liberties.
And so Lincoln and Washington were two leaders that certainly noted leaders in American history. What they did sets them apart from many other leaders for different reasons, and their background is incredibly different. Lincoln's story, really fascinating, because Lincoln starts off a very religious home, so to speak, because his father was an alcoholic, even though was a professing Christian, and the reports were that he would come home drunk, he would beat the family, and so as soon as Lincoln was able to get out of the house, he despised what happened in the name of Christianity, right? His father claiming to be a Christian, abusing him and the family. So Lincoln becomes a self-avowed atheist. Interestingly enough, starts memorizing passages of the Bible to debate against Christians about how the Bible is silly and dumb. And one of the things that the Bible actually says is that the word of God does not return void. And so as Lincoln is hiding those words in his heart, so to speak, never intending to use them for positive spiritual affirmation, when he becomes president, no president quoted the Bible more in speeches and writings than Abraham Lincoln. And it's arguable the reason he was able to do that was back up when he was an atheist, or proclaiming to be an atheist, when he was angry at his dad, at religion, maybe at God for letting this happen. And so he does this, but Lincoln, midlife, is living a very secular life.
Yeah.
Right? He's embracing kind of levels of debauchery. He's going around hooking up with different people, right? Certainly not living a moral life, as he's embracing kind of this hedonistic, sinful nature to its fullest. But he has these mental breakdowns because he recognizes this is detrimental. I'm not sure about this. I think this is bad. He ends up having kind of this redirection back to faith, which is interesting. That today that's what's debated is, well, Lincoln was never really a religious guy again. No, there's a lot of indication why we think that is not accurate. That there's actually accounts from people that knew him, pastors that knew him, that said, no, Lincoln came to me, we had conversation. We have letters.
Yeah, we have
from
letters.
Pastors.
Actually, Lincoln, there's a letter from the Reverend James Smith, a Presbyterian clergyman that became Lincoln's pastor and mentor. And he tells the first time he met Lincoln, he said, Lincoln came to me because Lincoln, after being an atheist, while he's an atheist, he's a free thinker is what it was often called. He became a law partner with Herndon, who was also a free thinker. So you got two atheist kind of guys running this law firm. And Reverend Smith says that Lincoln came to me, and when he came to me, here's what he told me. He told me, he says, I have looked at all the evidence, all the arguments for and against Jesus, all the evidence for and against Christianity. He said, it is very, very clear the evidence is for Christianity. I need to change my position. So I'm coming to you, Reverend Smith. I've chosen you. I want to learn under you. I want to learn about Jesus. I want to learn about that relationship. So Reverend James Smith really becomes the pastor of the Lincoln family, works with the Lincoln family. This is at the point in time that he enters the legislature, and right about the time he becomes a state legislator. A few years later, he starts running for U.S. Senator.
First of all, recruited to run as state legislator by the Lovejoys.
Lovejoy.
Okay, so the Lovejoys were part of the anti-slavery movement at the time, and so they recruit Lincoln to run as an anti-slavery candidate, which then becomes significant because after he serves state legislature, and then he's in the Senate, you said,
he runs for the Senate against Douglas, doesn't win,
got defeated.
Then he ran. He had been in Congress. He went from state legislator to Congress, and he was in Congress in the time serving with John Quincy Adams.
Yes, served one term in Congress, while John Quincy Adams was a leader of the anti-slavery movement, and Abraham Lincoln was chosen to go as an anti-slavery candidate. So this was already known about him. So he joins up with John Quincy Adams' anti-slavery movement. He's arguably being mentored by John Quincy Adams. He then loses re-election. That's when you said he ran for Senate, got defeated. And finally, as a Republican candidate, the very first Republican candidate ever to be elected as president, he does become president. And then the work of the anti-slavery movement. And obviously, there's a lot more to the story. One of the things worth noting is that as president, you do see in his tone. There's a really cool prayer proclamation, 1863, prayer and fasting saying, we've forgotten God. We have to remember God as a nation, or our nation won't last. We won't remain. You have the second inaugural address where the second half is pretty much nothing but referencing scripture and how that applies to situations that even, I mean, we could argue we're in today because it's still relevant in Scripture, but you see faith becoming very central in his life, especially later in life. We don't have time to tell the full story because we're really out of time right now. But this is why getting biographies like this are really fun to learn more of their story, who they were, what they did, and specifically how God used them to do really great things. There is a more adult version of Lincoln's story that's really neat. It was done by Stephen Mansfield called Lincoln's Battle
Really
with
good.
God.
Really neat.
And I say it's the adult version because it does go into some of that debauchery and some of that hedonistic lifestyle that maybe is not kid appropriate necessarily, but it does give you a really good picture of how Lincoln kind of swung on the pendulum and finally came back to God and some of the evidence for that. But these are two guys definitely, as American heroes, we should know their stories. Every American should know the stories of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln because those were two leaders, defining leaders in American history. So we want to help encourage you, learn more about those guys. We do have some biographies on WallBuilders.com that you can go, you can find more about that. Certainly look it up online, and we'll try to keep giving you some information along the way. Next week, we're going to get into some very specific topics. And we're going to spend the week just covering different topics and kind of doing a little topographical history in that regard. So we'll have one more week of One Room Schoolhouse, and then hopefully life is going to start normalizing for more of us. We're praying for you guys. If there's anything we can do for you, put a prayer request in the comment box, or if you have questions, put it in the comment box. We'll try to get to you. We'll see you next week on One Room Schoolhouse. One Room Schoolhouse. Words are hard sometimes.